educated crowd who deserve a deep dive into the subject, so that you can be prepared to present the evidence and to apologize for the Bible, at least the creation account, and get people to take seriously the Old Testament. I got saved about 42 years ago because of a fellow in my medical class led me to look at the scriptures from a scientific perspective. And because of that, because I was taught growing up, both in my Methodist church as well as in the school, that evolution was science and that creation was fantasy, that once I was shown that that was the opposite, I took the gospel seriously. So I think it's a real ministry, and it has brought a lot of people to Christ. So let's just kind of, and also I wanted to say as a premise here, the Bible is very clear in what it says. It's not foggy. It lays things out in clear terms, and it doesn't need a rocket scientist or a PhD to understand it, and it tells us clearly what has happened. But let's go to the book of John, the very first. In the beginning was the Word, Jesus Christ, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were created by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. And we know that throughout Jesus' ministry, He used creation in His miracles to validate his ministry. So He was the creator, He was the actor of the Trinity that created the universe, and He used creation throughout His ministry to validate that He was actually God. So the study of creation science and Genesis history is all about proclaiming the truth of the Bible and glorifying the Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ. Creation science and Noahic flood history versus evolution is really evidence that demands a verdict. And you'll see that evolution comes lacking. So my series of talks will be an intro today and a very important 6-minute snippet, a YouTube snippet, where we're going to see an interview by one of the priests of creation, of evolution, where he shows us that even he doesn't believe what he is preaching. We're going to have an introduction with a video. Days of Creation will be our second week. The Ark, which is a really great subject, and the flood. After that, we'll talk about flood geology. Everything we see around us can be explained from the Bible. The mountains, the layers in the earth, the continents, everything can be explained in the Scriptures. And then we get to the exciting topic of dinosaurs and fossilization. So credit for this lecture goes to Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, Northwest Creation Network. Everyone has a white paper. You can go to the websites. And these are invaluable resources for books and literature and answers to questions. So what's apologetics? Reasoned arguments or writings in justification of something, typically a religious a theory or a religious doctrine. We'll see that biblical apologetics demonstrates the reliability of the Genesis account of creation and the Noahic flood, refutes the stories of evolution and ancient universe as written in King James. So we have here 1 Peter says, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." I think we should be prepared as Christians to defend the book of Genesis. If we can't defend Genesis, we're on a very weak foundation. Biblical apologetics also helps us to understand biblical history, because if people just dig where the Bible tells them, that they always find what they're looking for in the Scriptures. It validates the Bible, and of course prophecy. I think it's a third of the Bible is prophecy, and we see that happening all around us today. So creation and flood apologetics relies upon linguistic evidence, that is, the King James Version of the Bible is clearly written, the words mean what they say, the context will sometimes dictate, but for the most part the words mean what they say, and scientific evidence will show ways in the direction of creation. So biblical apologetics shines the light on the truth of the Word of God, which will then speak for itself in conjunction with leading the Holy Spirit. So if we get people to look at the Word of God, the Spirit of God will take over. Howbeit, when He, the Spirit of truth, is come, He will guide you into all truth. But He shall not speak of Himself, but whatsoever He shall hear, that shall He speak, and He'll show you things to come. Creation science gives believers additional assurance of biblical authority and provides invaluable tools for sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what's evolution? What is the technical definition of evolution? the chance, random, undirected formation of the universe, earth, and man over long but limited amounts of time, without the existence of or intervention of a God or a designer. All thinking and feeling and emotions are just chemical reactions. There's no soul, and there's no spirit in man. Darwinism is a theory of biological evolution developed by English naturalist Darwin and others, stating that all species of all organisms arise and develop in the natural selection of small, inherited variations that increase the individual's ability to compete, survive, and reproduce. But as we're going to learn, even out of the mouth of one of the high priests of evolution, there's no evidence of any kind for evolution. Evolution is a purely blind faith-based religion. This fellow, this poor fool, Dawkins, who truly is the high priest of evolution living today, wrote a book back in 2006 called Delusion. And there his proposition, of course, is that God doesn't exist. He's a pure atheist. But you'll see out of his own mouth, he can't give you 100% assurance that God doesn't, or the designer doesn't exist. We had, when I was growing up in the 80s, one of the preachers of evolution was Carl Sagan. Sagan, when he was asked if he's an evolutionist, he said no, but this is the classic fallback line. I'm not that wise, but neither do I consider there to be anything approaching adequate evidence for such a God. He studied the universe and life his whole life as a scientist, and he couldn't see any evidence because he was willfully ignorant. So what is the evolution of life? Carl Sagan said, the secrets of evolution are time and death, time for the slow accumulation of favorable mutations, and death to make room for new species. So the story of evolution is a simple story. It's Earth, somehow over time turns into a frog, and the frog over a period of time turns into a prince. So that is the theory of evolution. It's that simple. It's the fairy tale we all learned growing up, and that's what evolution is. So what are living things made of? Living things are made up of cells, complex self-contained units made up of proteins, fats, carbohydrates, nucleic acid, which inside are made up of individual little mini-machines that carry out these highly specified tasks in a unified manner. So you have your typical cell, you've got a nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the little mitochondria, the Golgi bodies that transport, and this is a little factory. And our cell, our body has hundreds of millions of these little factories that all talk to each other and all work under the direction of a nucleus. It is a phantasm. So each of these separate little mini-machines are interconnected and work together under the direction of the brain, which is the nucleus. Now, each mini-machine needs energy or fuel to function. Fuel comes about as a result of aerobic respiration and a complex process called the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is an important series of chemical reactions turning ADP into ATP. So ADP is like an unwound spring, and ATP is like a wound spring. So these chemical reactions convert food into energy by winding up the spring. And these little wound springs, they roam throughout the cell, and as they unwind, they give the energy from the unwound spring to those little mini-machines to carry out certain tasks. Now, each part of the Krebs cycle must be working together in order for the end product to come about. One missing reaction, and there's no Krebs cycle. So this is called irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity is a term used to describe a characteristic of certain complex systems, whereby they need all their individual component parts in place in order to function. In other words, it's impossible to reduce the complexity or to simplify an irreducibly complex system by removing any of its component parts and still maintain its functionality. A watch, you take out the mainspring, you take out a hand, you take out one small part of a watch and it will cease to function. So it all has to be put together, it all has to be working together. So the Krebs cycle is irreducibly complex, and cells by definition are irreducibly complex. In all cells, what's the blueprint of the instructions that ties it all together? DNA. These two really bright guys, with the help of electron microscopy, they discovered that DNA was the blueprint of life. Deoxyribonucleic acid, all these fancy words, basically it forms a double helix of information. They form sentences. They take words. A few of these base pairs in a row will be words, and these words are formed into sentences, and the sentences are formed into paragraphs, and they give instructions for the little mini machines or for the cell to create more cells or to create a liver or a brain or an arm or a leg. So, and these things are all contained, of course, in the nucleus. So the nucleus, again, this contains all the DNA. Now, we've heard a lot about RNA, these injections that were developed supposedly to help treat COVID. This is messenger RNA. They're the scribes. They're the copy machines. What they do is the RNA goes inside the nucleus, makes a copy of a sentence or a paragraph, is transported outside of the nucleus, and then goes into a mini machine to produce, in this example, a protein. So in living cells, these chemical compounds are proteins, fats, carbohydrates, etc. They die within minutes. For example, a brain. If a brain doesn't have oxygen for a period of 10 minutes, it becomes jello. The cells in livers and kidneys, they will go into a stasis if you cool them and live long enough to be transplanted to somebody else. So, but for the most part, once the Krebs cycle is no longer functioning, most cells will die. This is called entropy. And entropy is a law in the universe where all things made by the input of work or energy will break apart back down into their simplest parts that they were made from, unless there's the continual input of energy or work. For evolution to work, you have to reverse and violate this law from the very beginning of the development of the first cell. So this is a critical issue. So in accordance with evolutionary theory, this extremely complex cell was built with work energy by some pure random chance event, without direction, without instructions. The energy source that was needed also came about by pure random chance events. So all of this fantastic stuff happened by chance, without any direction. And so the example really is, evolution is like building a car. You can put all of the components of a car in a room with 100 monkeys for 100 billion years, and you're not going to get a car. Because those monkeys they have much more intelligence than random movement of molecules, but they're still not going to produce a car. To make anything, whether cells or cars work, energy must be put into the process. Cells use the energy of the Krebs cycle, cars need the energy of humans, machines, all under the direction of humans. What happens if cars are not maintained with the continual input of work energy? What happens if you don't keep waxing it, cleaning it, oiling it, putting gasoline in it? If you give it a decade, it'll go back to the ground. All of its component parts will reduce back into their original components. The same thing with cells. We're made from the dirt. God made us from the dirt, and to the dirt we return. Cells, if they're not continually energized, will simply degrade, rot, and go back to the earth. Unlike what you're led to believe, evolution science, so-called, has no single working model for how the Krebs cycle or the first single cell came into existence. This religion is believed, like all cults, by authoritarian rule and not by science, not by knowledge. So the story gets even more complicated. We not only have a cell we have to evolve, what happens? The cell needs to learn how to divide. It needs to learn how to make a copy of itself and then pinch off to make two cells. So somehow, through chance random events, this complicated factory makes an exact copy of itself and makes another factory next door. All through chance random events. All of this happened by chance. So the story gets even more fantastic. The cell somehow figures out how to join together and make a multi-celled organism. And of course, through chance random events, it grows a brain, it grows legs, and one day it becomes a creature. So give that cell a few billion years, and it'll become a creature. So the engine of evolution is positive changes in DNA information. By chance, random events, a mistake happens whereby the words in the sentence of the DNA chain get mixed up, resulting in a new message, resulting in something totally different and new and positive. So that's the engine of evolution. So for example, you take a sentence with 20 words in it, cut each word into separate pieces of paper and throw the papers in the air. And how many times would it take to do that to get the papers to fall into a nice line giving you a new sentence with a new bit of information? That's how evolution works. The problem, as I just demonstrated with the paper, was that 99.999% of DNA mutations are deadly. and negative to cells. Essentially, all of these mutations, all of these sentences make no sense. So the old sentence that made up sense and told the cell what to do is now gone. So information, first of all, has been lost. And, or there'll be negative change. So example, missing information, missing chemical reactions, or the mini machines, they lose fingers, toes, or they lose information, basically. But evolution says that mistakes happen that result in the formation of new reactions, fingers, toes, arms, legs, brain, hair, internal organs, eyes. None of this has ever been seen as fantasy. It's pure fantasy. But it is the theory of evolution. It is the doctrine that's believed in every major university in the world today. There are single-cell bacteria and viruses that some researchers contend have developed positive mutations to adapt to environmental chemical changes such as antibiotics, which is called antibiotic resistance. In most cases, though, these changes are outworking of pre-existing information. It's like a blonde and a brunette marry, and they have someone with dark hair, because somewhere along the way, some uncle had, or some previous relative had dark hair, and they expressed that genetic information. But we've never seen a cell create a finger or a toe. They aren't growing legs, the cell structure never changes, never produces anything new or positive. Bacterial colonies multiply a gazillion times every day and mutate all day long, but never in 100 years of scientific observation has structural change ever been seen. Yeah. And as we'll learn later in the fossil record, evolutionists believe that this is a record of billions of years of evolution. But never have there ever been in the layers a transition of a frog turning into a prince. It's never been seen. Or even the intermediary forms of the frog turning into a pre-prince. Nothing is out there. And basically this fairy tale is foolishness. It's absolute foolishness. It's so foolish that Dr. Crick, remember we had Watson and Crick, these two guys that understood what DNA was? This fellow, he knew this was a joke, so he said, you know, we must have been spawned by space aliens. So he believed in space aliens. So he was sort of the founder of the space alien movement, that we are the product of space aliens, which of course is just more foolishness. And of course, where did the space aliens come from? Well, they evolved, right? I mean, this is extreme foolishness. So all of it goes back to silliness. The big question, if evolution is so foolish, why is it the only acceptable explanation for the existence of the universe and the explanation for life on Earth? That's the question. So we have to look at the history. And this is a contemporary problem. This is not something that ever existed up until 200 years ago. Right. So before the 1700s, mankind took the position that the universe and life could only be attributed to God or gods. All men were deists in one form or another. In the late 1700s, there were two movements. There were two very important movements in Western thinking. The age of science and the age of enlightenment. And the age of enlightenment also affected many of the founders of our country, like Jefferson. Jefferson was severely affected and impacted by the age of enlightenment. Both of these disciplines opened up the door of opportunity to discard the notion of God, particularly the notion of a biblical God. The Enlightenment was the age of reason, intellectual, cultural movement that emphasized reason over superstition and science over blind faith. Basically, it was humanism. And humanism says an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or the supernatural. Humanism is a life stance which affirms that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to their lives free of the constraint of a creator God. There is no God, and God essentially is dead. A dead God can't tell us what to do anymore. The shackles of being responsible to the creator were their philosophies. The final liberation of man, who is now free to think and do and enjoy life in any manner they please. Humanism is essentially pre-baked, pre-flood Noahic era thinking that was washed away 4,000 years ago by the flood, but unfortunately has come back over the past couple hundred years. Now, the age of science occurred around the same time. Science basically started as a movement of observing things. So people just said, why don't we catalog what we see? Put it in books, publish big books, show everyone how bright we are because we can write things down. And then they did a few different experiments. So there were some chemistry experiments in the 1700s, 1800s. So that was the early genesis of science. But science at that time was extremely primitive. Between the late 1700s and the early 20th century, science was primarily just recording observations and some limited chemistry experiments. There were microscopes around. People did see cells under the microscope 200-300 years ago, but they had no idea what was inside, like looking at a computer. I mean, you could look at a computer, but if you don't know what's inside, you could fantasize. As their academic arrogance matured, they became puffed up, cocky, and proud, leading them to believe that they could look into the past with certainty and discard the biblical narrative. Darwinian evolutionary theory of life was developed and popularized as fact in the mid-1800s without any scientific basis. Okay, so it was a theory. It gave people the opportunity to throw God away. It was liberating, as you'll hear this character Dawkins say shortly. It gave people the freedom to be, our parents are dead. Finally, we can do whatever we want. Humanism and evolution are cooperative blended philosophies, complementing each other on the direction of Satan to compete with the truth of the Bible. Okay, what's science? We heard in the past 2 years that Anthony Fauci was science. Of course, his science changed every week. So he wasn't science. Science doesn't change. Science is one truth. Science, the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation, experimentation, such as in all these disciplines. So it's pure academic discipline that things are proven to be true, and absolutely 100%. That this is a pointer, and we know it's a pointer, and no one can call it a fish. If something is called scientific, it means it's been proven to be completely true, and the experiment is repeatable, like baking a cake. If you buy a cookbook, that's a science book. It basically tells you how to make things, and so it's a pure science book. Historical science, though, is like conspiracy theory. You know, conspiracy theory means something is a potential hoax. It's neither conspiracy nor theory, so it means it's a hoax. But historical science is conjecture or theory about what might have happened in the past, for which there is no direct experimental verification. Historical science takes raw data from things observed in the here and now and tries to make it fit into their ideas. So it's conjecture. Evolutionary science is historical science, a faith-based belief in various theories about the development of an infinite pre-existing universe and life on Earth. It interprets data with bias. Okay, creation science is also historical science. So we have to give, not the devil their due, but we have to admit that creation science is not 100%. Evolution is proven to be 100% false, but creation is not yet proven to be 100% true. There are some mysteries that are still out there. It's a singular approach and belief of the subject of origins and history that relies upon the biblical account is the lens through which we look at everything. Neither approach can be proven, yet an objective individual, not somebody who's willfully ignorant or blind, an objective individual interpreting the data will see that through the biblical lens, we can see that it accounts for everything we see on Earth. Creationists have the Bible as a roadmap for interpreting raw scientific data, which in turn validates the biblical account. Creationists have always been educated in evolution. The irony is that creationists start out as evolutionists. Evolutionists start out as evolutionists, but they will not consider creation. So all creationists know the story of evolution, but very, 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 very few evolutionists know the account of creation. Evolutionists, on the other hand, refuse to allow the biblical account to be considered as explanations for the universe and life. Instead, they censor each other, they censor creationists, and will only consider their blind faith-based chance events as the basis upon which to view the universe. In 2006, Ben Stein, who is he's not a devout Jew, but he's a Jew-deist, and a rather well-known actor and also a financial expert, and he came out with a movie called Expelled. And I would encourage everybody to purchase the movie or attempt to see it. In fact, you can't see it on Amazon Prime. They've taken it off. Oh. It is a classic film that exposes academic arrogance. So there are some difficult issues for creationists to struggle with, such as starlight and time. We'll talk about that in later lectures. We can call them unsolved mysteries, and yet there are good scientific reasons even here Yet even discounting these mysteries, the scale tips completely in the direction of the biblical narrative for the universe and life on Earth. For almost 100 years before science became real science, and not just observation, the Darwinian evolutionary theory became entrenched dogma, as unquestionable as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. By the time that the science is developed to demonstrate that evolution is impossible, a false premise, the world became convinced that evolution was an unquestionable fact. The academic proponents of evolution knew that it was flawed. They knew that it could not be proven, but they were committed. It's their source of income, it's their religion, and it has to be defended at all costs. For Satan, evolution would become the ultimate weapon used against the biblical account, hence destroying the biblical narrative of the origins of the universe and God's relationship with mankind. With evolution, there is no eternal mind or spirit, there is no afterlife, there is no sin, and there is no God. With evolution, life has no ultimate purpose. So in the words of this atheist, Mr. Bozar, it becomes clear now that the whole justification of Jesus' life and death is predicated on the existence of Adam and the forbidden fruit he and Eve ate. Without the original sin, who needs to be redeemed? Without Adam's fall into a life of constant sin terminated by death, what purpose is there to Christianity? Absolutely none. Thomas Huxley, a famous physician and biologist, this fellow was Darwin's bulldog, and he popularized Darwinian evolution. If Adam may be held to be a personage no more than Prometheus, and if the story of the fall is merely an instructive type comparable to the Promethean myth, what value has Paul's dialectic? And what about the authority of the writers of the book of the New Testament, who, on this theory, have not merely accepted the flimsy fictions for solid truths, and have built the very foundations of Christian dogma upon legendary quicksand? That is what 99% of the people in the world believe today. And then we have these so-called Christian leaders and proponents of evolution. Sadly, the vast majority of leadership that calls itself Christian does not hold to the veracity of the book of Genesis. We'll learn in week 2 about 3 synergistic theories. We have gap theory, we have theistic evolution, and I can't believe I'm blanking on the third one. So we have gap theory, we have theistic evolution, we have day age. There are some attempts by Christians to look at evolution and somehow fit it into the Bible. We'll see that's totally impossible. So, how did sin arise? The Garden of Eden is a myth. This is a famous Anglican priest. The Garden of Eden is a myth, a historical tale embodying spiritual truth. From the viewpoint of anthropology, it's exceedingly unlikely that there was ever a first man and woman. This myth contains great truths. Human beings are the results of evolution, shaped by natural selection. Self-centeredness and aggression were essential at every stage of evolution. Human beings naturally inherit this self-centeredness, original sin, and without it, babies could not survive. So sin is a good thing. Sin is a very, very positive attribute. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. Grace be with you. Amen. So the day will come, says Mr. Bozart, and I think for the most part, quite frankly, in universities today, this is a truism, where the evidence constantly accumulating around the evolutionary theory becomes so massively persuasive that even the last and most fundamental Christian warriors will lay down their arms and surrender unconditionally. I believe that day will be the end of Christianity. Most quote-unquote Christian schools today, with some exceptions, will teach theistic evolution. They basically abandon the Word of God at the behest of phony scientists, just like the Anthony Fauci's of the world. Phony scientists who control the narrative. So a lie repeated often enough becomes accepted as truth and dogma. Look at the COVID hoax, where we now know that the figures are inflated 400%, and proper care is withheld by government, and injections are harmful and don't even protect against COVID. The myth of the pandemic is imprinted on the populace. I mean, if you go to somebody and that you don't know, if you call it a hoax, they get all upset because they think you're being political. So it's the same with evolution. It's this dogma that's been imprinted upon people. And then we have the farce of excluding creation science and Genesis history from being taught in the public schools. Academic evolutionary terrorists going back 80 years have won the battle, unfortunately. Our public schools won't even consider another thought process. As were many persons from Alabama, I was a born-again Christian when I was 15. I entered the Southern Baptist Church with great fervor. First of all, I don't believe the guy was ever born again, but that's beside the point. And interested in the fundamentals of religion. I left at 17 when I got to the university and heard about the theory of evolution. He found out there was no sin, that he could be free of God. So why is the certainty of origins in biblical history so critical? Why is what you hold to be true about the subject so vital? How does this subject set the basis for how the world functions or not? The world we live in is a mess. There are unlimited views of life and death, and there's confusion all around us. The foundation for this confusion is uncertainty about God and the belief in a meaningless existence. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, the entire Bible, as Jesus said, and doeth them, I will liken unto a wise man which built his house on a rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew, beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. For us to have the most effective presentation of the gospel, we must be prepared to defend the veracity and the complete truth of the Bible from cover to cover. The biblical foundation of that book, our Bible, is Genesis. Any doubt of any account, even the accuracy of any of the meanings of the words, especially in the book of Genesis, brings the entire Bible into question. If the account in Genesis is not 100% accurate, then it means that the entire Bible is brought into question. Faith becomes blind. Because blind faith, we don't have blind faith. Born-again Christians have clarity of thought. Our faith is not blind. It's based on the truth. Otherwise, it's a myth. So the evolutionists have been very successful. They destroyed the book of Genesis. Christianity has essentially fallen. They were successful the past 200 years. If we're going to have any effect, at least on a personal level, with unbelievers, we have to destroy evolution in order to have any ability to get to their minds. Their minds have been polluted and tainted. So evolution as a scientific theory has no credibility, as we'll learn, but as a philosophical principle, it's invaluable to shedding mankind from the obligations to the Creator God. Creation science, the biblical account, on the other hand, can be shown to be the correct explanation for the creation of the universe and life on earth. The beginning and the end of the matter is that evolution is a lie. Ken Ham wrote a great book on it. He called it Lie. It's a blatant, rotten lie. So before we get to our video, I'd like to answer an important question. Is believing in young earth Genesis account of creation and Genesis world history essential to my salvation? So this is a subject that comes up, and I think you've got to put the cart before the horse. Agreement with God in our sin is a barrier to our relationship with Him, and then accepting the shed blood of Jesus Christ for the remission of our sin is the sole basis for our salvation. But agreement with the veracity of the Bible is a litmus test of our walk with God. The book of Genesis is simply written, straightforward, and verifiable. Agreement with it is also foundational to a more effective presentation of the gospel. So, let's get to our video. I'm going to...
Now, when you say young earth, what do you mean?
6 24-hour days and 6,000 years ago. The earth was created between 6 and 7,000 years ago. Period. It's an indisputable fact. The fact that people say, well, the stars are billions of light years away. This can be explained, as you'll see next week. So, our earth is young, and it was created in 6 24-hour days.
Amen.
This is an indisputable fact. It's not something I'll argue with anybody about. It's something I will present. You can take the evidence, take it or leave it, but it's an indisputable fact.
Amen.
Because it was stated in the scriptures.
Amen.
So I think it has to stand. Sometimes you have to be really doctrinaire. And that's where these so-called Christian leaders have really dropped the ball. Because they themselves are either heretics or apostates. Sometimes there are sincere men of God, and I think the sincere men of God, like Schofield, came up with the gap theory. They tried to fit this billions of years in between day 1 and 2, which is a real hoax. Because they had friends that they really respected, because they had all these fancy degrees. We can't look to a PhD to tell us what God said. It's just impossible. So this is a really great video. You're going to hear Dawkins interviewed by Ben Stein, and really listen to every word carefully.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. How are you? I'm Ben Stein. I'm so sorry to keep you waiting. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
You have You have written that God is a psychotic delinquent invented by mad, deluded people.
No, I didn't say quite that. I said something rather better than that.
Oh, well, please tell us what you said. Please tell us.
Well, I'll have to read it from the book.
No, please.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
So that's what you think of God?
Yeah.
How about if people believe in a God of infinite lovingness and kindness and forgiveness and generosity, sort of like the modern day God? Why spoil it for them?
Oh,
Why not just let them have their fun and enjoy it?
I mean, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. I write a book, people can read it if they want to. I believe that it is a liberating thing to free yourself from primitive superstition.
So religion is a primitive
Oh,
superstition.
I think it is, yes.
So you believe it's liberating to tell people that there is no God?
I think a lot of people, when they give up God, feel a great sense of release and freedom.
Why do you think that? I mean, what's your dad? What's your scientist? What's your dad?
I think, well, I've had a lot of letters saying that, and
There are 8 billion people in the world.
Yeah,
Dr. Dawkins. How many letters have you
no,
had?
I haven't done that. That's quite true.
Professor Dawkins seemed so convinced that God doesn't exist that I wondered if he would be willing to put a number on it.
Well, it's hard to put a figure on it, but I mean, I put it as something like, 99% against or something.
Well, how do you know it's 99%?
I don't.
Say 97.
No, I did. You asked me to put a figure on it, and I'm not comfortable putting a figure on it. I think it's, I just think it's very unlikely.
What? But you couldn't put a number on it.
No, of course not.
So it could be 49%.
Well, it would be. I mean, I think it's unlikely, but it's quite far from 50%.
How do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I put an argument in the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, how did that happen?
I've told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
Nor has anyone.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
But that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So, Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
So the Hebrew God, the God of the Old Testament, he doesn't exist in your view?
Certainly, I mean, that would be a very unpleasant prospect.
And the Holy Trinity of the New Testament?
Nothing like that.
Do you believe in any of the Hindu gods? Like Vishnu?
How can you ask such a question?
You don't,
How
right?
could I? I
You
mean,
believe
why
in-
would I, given that I don't believe in any others?
You don't believe in the Muslim God?
No. And why do you even need to ask?
Well, I just wanted to be sure. So you don't believe in any God anywhere?
Any God anywhere would be completely incompatible with with anything that I've said
I just wanted to make sure you don't believe in any God anywhere.
No.
What if after you died you ran into God and he said, what have you been doing, Richard? I mean, what have you been doing? I've been trying to be nice to you. I gave you a multi-million-dollar paycheck over and over again with your book, and look what you did.
Bertrand Russell had that point put to him, and he said something like, "Sir, why did you take such pains to hide yourself?"
But if the intelligent design people are right, God isn't hidden. We may even be able to encounter God through science, if we have the freedom to go there. What could be more intriguing than that?
So if he's your preacher, man, throw him out of the church. I mean, this guy's representing the Church of Evolution. I mean, what a fool. And this guy is the guy who represents the whole world. The Church of Evolution, he's the Pope. So even he can't make a decent defense of this idiocy. And yet we can't go into a public school and say, well, let's talk about intelligent design. They refuse. It's just with COVID. It's the same with COVID. COVID is the best example, best contemporary example. It's all lies, but it's a government narrative, and if you defeat the lies, you're thrown out of the church. I mean, it's really something. So I want to thank everybody. If you have questions before, I'd like you to be prolific, because it'll help me to engineer the next 4 weeks. If you have thoughts, the things that you want to see covered, or you have comments on the lecture, send me emails, and I'll incorporate those things into future. And I would ask for your prayers as well. God willing, I'd like to use this as an outreach. It may be an opportunity for the unsaved community around us to attract them to come in and learn something which I know a majority of people have never ever heard. That what they are taught, what they believe, is a hoax. So thank you very, very much. Could someone turn the lights on? Because I don't want anyone to fall in the clothes.